highlighting Passion Week. This week is a very important week for us in the life of us as Christians. I mean, it solidifies for us Jesus coming to this earth and solidifying hope for us. So I've been tasked with looking at the Wednesday of Passion Week. And really, when you look at the events of Passion Week, the Wednesday really is not that exciting of a day. I mean, there's really not much going on in Jesus' life. What I wanted to do is look at what brought Jesus to this point. I mean, what led up in Jesus' life that now he's sitting in Jerusalem, and the next 4 days are going to get very, very crazy and very, very important for us. But at Wednesday, let's look back and see what brought Jesus to this point. And I think that can be an important day for us in just seeing that God had a plan in bringing Jesus to this point. And if he had a plan in bringing Jesus to this point, that plan is going to carry out in the next 4 days as well. So let's dive in and let's look a little bit. We're going to look at a lot of text today. We're going to have it up here on the board so that you can follow along. But as I was listening to the radio the other day, I heard a preacher say, he said, Jesus chose to be a Jew. And I heard that, and it kind of resonated with me, and I didn't hear what else he said because I was just kind of poring over that statement. And really, it's true. Jesus was the only person in history that chose his nationality and his ethnicity. So we see that Jesus chose that, and we know that Jesus is intentional because he's God. So there's a question of why would Jesus, as God, choose to be a Jew? I mean, there's probably greater nations he could have chose to be a part of. In fact, when he walked the earth, he could have chose to be a part of the Roman Empire. And they were the superpower of the day. They had great territories and everything. So why would Jesus choose to be a Jew from this tiny territory that was occupied by Rome? That was really no bigger than the size of New Jersey. Why is Jesus choosing this? And I think, one of the answers that we could give is this, is 1 Corinthians 1:27, which says, God chose the weak things of the world to humble the strong. And in weakness, his power is made manifest. And what we see is that it's through the weak things in the world that God shows his divine power. And it's through this weak nation of Israel that God was going to show that his power and salvation coming to the world was going to come through Jesus. That's a very simple and broad answer, but I think that there's even a more specific answer that I'd like to look at today. And I think that it's this, is that Jesus' Jewishness confirmed 2,000 years of prophecy that pointed to Messiah being a Jew. Jesus is confirming that God was provident in salvation from page 1 of the Bible to the very end of the Bible. Jesus' Jewishness is very important. In fact, Jesus himself in John chapter 5, verse 39 says that the scriptures testify about me. Now we know that Jesus was living in a time when the New Testament hadn't been written, so the scriptures he's talking about were the Old Testament texts. He's saying that the Old Testament is pointing to him coming to the earth and being salvation for all. So I want to jump back into the Old Testament today and look at how it points us to Jesus and how it's pointing us to him being our Messiah. So let's go all the way back to page 1 of your Bibles. In Genesis chapter 3, in the very foundation of the world, God promises something to Adam and Eve that he is going to come and bring salvation for all. And we see it right here. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What we see is that God, after Adam and Eve have sinned, after they've done wrong, after they've chosen themselves over God, he curses the world because that is the natural product for our sin. But then in that curse, he offers a blessing, the blessing of delivering us from the power of Satan, delivering us from the power of the sin in our lives, that we can have power and new life in him. He's promising a Messiah, a Savior to come and to save the world. So he's promising that all the way back in the very foundation of the world. And in this, God is communicating his love to us. Because what he's saying is this, is that even though you've messed up, even though you've sinned, I have a plan because I love you and I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to save you. And he promised that in Genesis chapter 3. We go later on in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. God is talking to a man by the name of Abraham. And as he's talking to Abraham, he promises him that one day he will have land as a nation, that he will have a son to provide him with offspring, and that he's also going to be a blessing to all nations. We see that in the promise here. He says, Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, And him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. See, what God is promising in the Abrahamic covenant is this. He's saying, you're going to have a son. And what we know about Abraham's life up to this point is that he's old and his wife is not able to have kids. But God is going to bring them a son, and that son's name is Isaac. Then Isaac has a son named Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons that ultimately go on to become the 12 tribes of Israel. So the great nation that God is promising to come from Abraham is the nation of Israel. But not only is he promising the nation of Israel, but he's promising that from the nation of Israel, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That means Egypt will be blessed. That means the Roman Empire will be blessed. That means America will be blessed through the people of Israel. God's making a promise to Abraham. And that promise is that the Messiah will bring salvation to the world. That the blessing that he's talking about is a blessing that the world will be saved from its sin in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So it's very important for us to see that the great blessing was that Jesus was going to be born a Jew and be that blessing to all the world. But then we go on to 2 Samuel 7, verse 13. God is talking to David now, and he forms a covenant with David, and he says this. He says that your son David, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. He's telling David that from him, his kingdom and his reign and his lineage will reign forever and ever and ever. And we know that a king's reign is only as long as he's living here on this earth. So for a king to reign forever, he would have to have eternal qualities. So God is saying that the king that's going to come from you, David, is going to be an eternal king. Well, if we look at the Jewish history, we know that right after David, his son Solomon reigned. And after Solomon, the line of David is cut off. That there's no longer a seed of David that's ruling and reigning on the throne. So we read a prophecy like this, and we'd say, well, what's going to happen? David's lineage is not carrying out. But then in Matthew chapter 1, in the lineage of Jesus Christ, we see that God fulfills this promise in the life of Jesus Christ, that he was born, that he was a descendant of David, that in his birth, he was fulfilling the Davidic covenant, that he was going to be the king who reigns forever because he is God, and he can do that. So we see that Jesus is being declared as King of the Jews in his birth by the Magi, and also in his death by Pilate as he wrote the inscription above the cross. That both the Magi and Pilate, Gentile people, were declaring that Jesus was the King of the Jews. But long before they ever declared that Jesus was King of the Jews, way back in the Old Testament, thousands of years before, God was promising to David that Jesus would be the King of the Jews who would reign forever and ever. So these histories are very important for us to understand. But now we're going to jump into the prophecy. When we look at the prophets, we see that there are over 300 prophecies about Messiah that point us to Jesus, that are fulfilled in his life. Fulfilled, like actually carried out and done. So we're going to look at 8 today. I promise you we will not look at all 300 because we have a short time on this video. But we're going to look at 8 prophecies, and I hope that you'll stick through to the end. We'll go through them very quick because I want to explain to you why I only chose 8 prophecies to look at today. So the first prophecy is this, is Micah 5:2. It says that Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Micah the prophet prophesied that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and we see that was ultimately fulfilled in Jesus' life in Matthew chapter 5, verse 2. What this is saying is that there is going to be a very specific area, a very specific town that Jesus or the Messiah is going to come from. Now when we look at prophecies and people like Nostradamus or even modern day prophets, their prophecies are very broad, because if they're very broad, the probability of them coming true is very high. So they don't say very specific things. But God was promising to Micah a very specific thing, that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, a very small town in a very small area, in a very small region that was occupied in Israel. So we see that this very small town was Bethlehem, and that's a very specific prophecy that's fulfilled in the life of Jesus. The second prophecy is Zechariah 9:9. This was the prophecy that we looked at this past Sunday, with Palm Sunday. And the prophet Zechariah says that Messiah will come on a donkey and that the people will declare him to be king. Well, we know through Palm Sunday in Matthew 27:37 that Jesus, in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, was riding on a donkey, and the people were declaring him to be king. We say, well, if we were skeptics looking at this, we'd say, okay, well, maybe there was somebody who was born in Bethlehem, and maybe that somebody who was born in Bethlehem decided to come into Jerusalem on a donkey, and they fulfilled those two prophecies. Well, could they be Messiah? Well, if those were the only two prophecies we had about Messiah, maybe. But we have 300 that they would have to fulfill that Jesus fulfills in his life. The third prophecy is Zechariah 11:12-13, which says that Messiah will be sold for 30 pieces of silver. Again, a very specific prophecy here with a very specific amount of a very specific kind of currency. And we see that ultimately that's fulfilled in Matthew 26:15-16, that Judas agrees to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Again, a prophecy hundreds of years before Jesus walked the earth that he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver came true in his life. Very, very important for us to see that Jesus is fulfilling these very specific prophecies. The fourth one is this, Isaiah 7:14. It says the Messiah will be born of a virgin. This is probably the most well-known prophecy that we have because it comes up every single year at Christmas. We see that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. And that was ultimately fulfilled in Jesus' life. In Matthew chapter 1, verses 22-23, he was born of a virgin named Mary. Now, we look at this and we say, okay, that's a well-known prophecy, but it's a miraculous prophecy because virgins don't have babies. It's impossible. So the only thing it could be was be a miracle. So when it says that Messiah will be born of a virgin, it's talking about a miraculous birth, and the miraculous birth was a sign in Jesus' life as well. The fifth prophecy is Isaiah 53:12, which says that Messiah will be killed with criminals. This one seems pretty generic. There's lots of people who died with other criminals. So we see is that this is a pretty generic prophecy, but we see that it was fulfilled in Jesus' life in Matthew 27:38. He was actually hung between two thieves, that he was killed with criminals. We say, well, okay, that's a pretty easy one to fulfill. Lots of people have fulfilled that. But just think about this. This is one of 300 prophecies. If this one prophecy were not to come true in Jesus' life, then we could logically conclude and logically attack the credibility of Jesus being Messiah, because this was a claim of Messiah. But Jesus didn't miss one prophecy. He fulfilled all the prophecies. That's very important for us to see. So the sixth prophecy is Psalm 22:7-8. It says Messiah will be mocked. And literally, it says that they will say, "Let God save him." Again, a very specific prophecy that's fulfilled in Matthew 27:43. The Pharisees themselves, as they're standing underneath the cross, they look at Jesus and they say, he saved so many people, let God save him. And what they were doing was fulfilling prophecy hundreds of years previous that was written in the Psalms, that was pointing to Jesus, that very specific words were going to come true in Jesus' life. The seventh one is Psalm 34:20, which says that Messiah's bones will not be broken. And we see that ultimately that's fulfilled in John 19:32-33. And if there was ever a prophecy that I thought, maybe this one wouldn't happen, it would be this one. Because in John's account, we read that the centurions came and broke the legs of the thief on the left. They broke the legs of the thief on the right. But when it came to Jesus, instead of carrying out the same method that they had carried out for every crucifixion prior, that they had just done to the two people previous on either side of him, they chose to grab a spear and to pierce Jesus' side. And we look at that and we say, well, that's crazy. No, that's God's providence. God was planning that all the way back in Psalm, that he was going to do that through his son Jesus. So again, this prophecy points to Jesus. The last one is Psalm 16:10. It says that Messiah will not stay dead. Specifically, that passage says, you will not let your Holy One, which is a term for Messiah, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. And in the Hebrew language, that term for corruption is death. So it's saying that Messiah will not stay dead. We see that Jesus, he died on the cross, he was buried for 3 days, and then he rose again, and we know that he is ruling and reigning in heaven. We see that he did not stay dead, and he fulfilled this prophecy in every single letter of what it was saying. So we look at these 8 prophecies and we say, well, why did you choose 8? Why only 8 prophecies? Well, for time reasons, we didn't want to go through 300. But through 8, there was a man by the name of Peter Stoner who wrote a book called Science Speaks. And Peter Stoner took just 8 prophecies of Jesus. And he took those prophecies and he polled people on the probability of them happening. And he looked at the mathematics behind it, and he's a much greater mind than I ever could be. But he took the mathematics and pulled the probability of these things happening in one person. That if these 8 things were to happen in one person, what would be the probability of that happening? And he came to a number. The number was this. It was 1 multiplied by 10 to the 17th power. Let me break that down for you. That's a 1 with 17 zeros behind it. He said that the probability of just these 8 prophecies coming true in one man in all of history was 1 in 1 quadrillion. That number is almost incalculable. It's hard for us to even fathom a number that's big, right? It's bigger than Donald Trump's salary, which is crazy. But what we see is that for us to visualize this, he painted a picture for us. He said, take the state of Texas, one of the biggest states in our country. He said, imagine a quarter. Take a quarter, and we're going to cover the state of Texas in quarters. And not just cover the state of Texas in quarters, but let's cover the state of Texas in quarters 2 feet deep. So now we're talking 2 feet of quarters on the state of Texas. You walk anywhere you want in Texas, you sign a coin, you throw it back in there, you shake up Texas, and you move all the coins around, you blindfold somebody, and then you send them into Texas to find that coin, and they find it on their first try. The probability of them doing that is 1 in 100 quadrillion. We say, well, the probability is crazy. The chance of that happening is just wild. But it was not chance with our God. You see, our God on page 1 of our Bible was spelling out salvation, and he was promising his Messiah throughout all of the Old Testament, and was pointing that this was a sure thing that was going to happen. It was not a probability equation. It was a sure thing that God was going to bring Jesus, and he was going to fulfill all the prophecies of Messiah. So as we look at this, I say, well, why do we look at this? Why are we looking at this in Passion Week this week? Well, we see that what happens in the life of Jesus in the next 4 days is going to get very, very crazy. The next 4 days are going to mark very, very uncertain times as Jesus goes into a false trial, is beaten and spit on and mocked, and then ultimately crucified. And he dies and he's laid in the tomb, and then he rises again. The whole Passion Week from this point on escalates very quickly. And if we were to just look at the Passion Week without any of this knowledge, we'd say, man, this seems like unforeseen circumstances. This seems like how could God be in control of any of this? A perfect man is being on trial for something he didn't do, and he's going to be killed for it. What is God doing? That would be a natural question. But if we look at Wednesday and we look back at all that God has done, we see that God was orchestrating all of this. And if God orchestrated it all up to Wednesday of Passion Week, he orchestrated all of the rest of the events of Passion Week as well. That the way that Jesus died was orchestrated by God to satisfy his wrath towards our sin, and that ultimately he would rise again and give us that hope. So God is in control of these. This is not an out-of-control circumstance for God. He's in control of these circumstances. And what that encourages us with is that if God is in control of the most unforeseen circumstances in Jesus' life, then he's in control of our circumstances as well. As we walk through Easter 2020 and our week and our services look different than they've ever looked in history, we know that God is not taken off guard, but God has a plan through all of this. Just like he had a plan to bring salvation through Jesus, he planned it, and he knew that that was the only way that he could secure salvation for the world. That's the only way that Jesus could fulfill what he promised to Abraham, that he would be a blessing to all nations and to the whole entire world. See, the cross, it seemed like the most out of control of days, but actually God was the most in control in those days because he was divinely orchestrating salvation for us. I want to leave you with this verse because I think it's an encouragement as we go through the rest of Passion Week. It's an encouragement that God had a plan from page 1. It's 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says, "For our sake, God made him," being Jesus, "to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become his righteousness." What it's saying is that Jesus took our penalty on himself on the cross, and he paid it in full so that we as sinful people could be declared righteous before a holy God. What it's telling us is that was God's plan all along. That God's plan in Genesis chapter 3 was that he would make his son to be sin who knew no sin so that we might become his righteousness. God's plan was to bring righteousness to us and to declare us righteous in his eyes because of what Jesus did. It was his plan from day one, and that is why Jesus chose to be a Jew. Because in Jesus choosing to be a Jew, he was fulfilling years of prophecy, but he was making God's power perfect in weakness. Because in him, the magnitude of God's power was put on display for all the world to see. We hope that this devotional encouraged you today, that as we look in this week of the Passion and as we look at Jesus' death that's coming soon, we hope that it encourages you that God is in control and God has provided salvation, and he's provided it for you and he's provided it for many others. So we need to go and preach the gospel. I pray that this is encouraging to you. I pray that you have a great night.